Greetings and welcome. My name is Ras and this is R.A.S. Greetings everyone. My name is Ras John. Welcome to our project here in southern Spain. We have about a 10-20 hectare farm and we're on the southern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, which is some of the biggest mountains in Spain. So the reason we're putting this video together today, the reason I'm inviting you here on this journey is because we'd like to share our experiences of what we've been up to here. And I'd like to show you how if you have the right resources, you can actually grow a forest quite quickly. And here we have behind us a field, which is quite a dry, deserted landscape. You can see there's not much growing. There's a little bit of retama, a few grasses, but that's basically about it. So we started our first project about a year and a half ago, and then we started another project about 6 months ago, and this is what it used to look like. So just in a moment we're going to take a journey about 30 meters that way to show you what we've achieved in that. Okay, so here we are, just 30 meters away from where we were before, in that very dry field. And this is what we've achieved after only 6 months. So everything that you see behind me was planted 6 months ago. Like I said, we've got very good resources here. We've got a good amount of water, we've got a good amount of manure in the ground, a good amount of minerals in the ground. This is what we call Regenerative Agroforestry System, R.A.S. for short. And this is heavily inspired by something called syntropic agriculture. But we're not calling this syntropic agriculture, partly because it's not pure enough. We don't want to upset any professional syntropic practitioners. We've basically got a line of trees, and then we've got 2 rows of vegetables, and then we've got another line of trees, and then 2 rows of vegetables, another line of trees, 2 rows of vegetables. It's like a code that just keeps repeating itself. And all of the lines of trees are planted on contour, so they follow the topographical lines of the landscape. But this is the only line in the system that has subtropical trees. In all of the rest of the system, the trees are either temperate or Mediterranean, meaning that they will deal with the climate that we have with no problem. Even if a cold winter comes, they will survive. So let me just walk through this line with you for a second and give you an idea of some of the things that we've got growing here, to give you an idea of the nature of the subtropical mix that we've got here. So for example, we've got in here the Polonia, we've got mulberry, we've got banana, we've got a red guava. This is a pigeon pea, something that we'll speak about in more detail in a future video. We've got nispera, more bananas. Here's some clary sage. Here's some lentiscus, which you can also graft pistachios onto. Here we have a lychee tree, one of my favorite subtropical fruits. This is an amelia for biomass production. More mulberries. As I've said, we have the Polonia and the moringa. Here we have more of the pigeon pea. And yeah, all sorts of tropical things in this line. Here we have more bananas. And here, for example, is a flower that we've been growing to help the beneficial pollinators, the butterflies, the bees. And we've just started to collect the seed now for next year. And this is called a Mexican sunflower. And we're going to be planting this throughout the entire system next year because we really love it. It's a really beneficial part. Here we have an avocado, just here. Some of these trees grew by themselves and they're welcome to be here as part of the system. What else have we got growing in here? Let's have a look. This is a white or a yellow guava, where the other one we saw was a red or a pink guava. We have another banana here, and again these bananas will be growing partly for the fruit, but also we can use them as biomass accumulation. We can actually chop them down and feed them to the system as organic matter. So here we have a zapote. This is a tropical fruit from I think it's from the Colombian rainforest. Pretty much anywhere you can grow avocados, you can also grow this. Somewhere on the ground here we've got a small soap nut, so we're trying to also grow our own soap and detergent. Another banana, another Polonia. Here we have a carambola. This is a star fruit, also quite subtropical. But I've had good success with it on my farm for about 4 or 5 years now. And coming up to the end of the line here, we have more Paulownia, banana. We even have eucalyptus, something that I'll speak about later on. I used to think that these trees should be illegal, but now I'm growing them in abundance because I know now how to manage them, and that's one of the most important things about them. Here we have a macadamia tree, one of my favorite nuts, and another moringa tree, another big tall moringa tree at the end here, and we also have a small carob tree. So yeah, really interesting mix of things on this line. So here we are in the other section of food forest that we started, and this section was started about 1.5 years ago. And as you can see, we're almost standing in what we could call a young forest already. In human society, in modern agriculture and modern ecosystem restoration, often we separate things too much. And my feeling is that, we do all of our food production over there on commercial farms, and we do all of our reforestation over there in certain places. But what this type of agroforestry wants to do is bring those two things together. So we want to basically have ecosystem restoration through food production. Or we could even turn that on its head and say we want food production through ecosystem restoration. So basically, every time we grow trees, we're growing foods for us. We'll grow foods for ourselves. And every time we grow food, we're growing trees for the future. So by linking these two ideas together of reforestation and food production, it basically means that we're making sure a future is possible. Because as humans, we can be fairly kind of surface, we can be fairly day-to-day mentality. We're going to make sure there's enough food for all of us at the end of each day, or at least we can try. But we often don't make sure there's enough trees being planted for the future or future generations. Not just the humans, but all of the animals and beings that are going to benefit from that. So once again, now that we're really inside the system, you can start to see that we have these lines of trees that are planted on contour. And these lines are about 5 meters apart, something like that. And then in between the two lines of trees, we have 2 rows of vegetables. And as you can see, you can probably see we've got a little of this tall grass on either side. And this is basically the grass we've got growing in the pathways themselves. So rather than just having a pathway that's just empty and is not giving any production, because we've got enough water here on this site, we can afford to be able to grow things like sorghum, which is what this is. We also grow things like alfalfa. In the winter we'll grow things like wheat and barley and rye. But none of these things we grow for the grain or the seed. We literally just use it for the biomass, for the organic matter. So we're constantly chopping and dropping this organic matter and feeding it to the vegetables or to the trees. So that's something we'll look at next, is how the idea of this type of agriculture is not to grow plants, but actually we grow soil, and in the soil we'll grow the plants for us. Okay, so here we are in a different line between 2 other tree lines. Also we have some artichokes growing here. Here there's some bulb fennel. Here we have some okra growing. There's a little one that's pretty much ready. You don't want to let your okra get too big because then they get too fibrous. I'm going to stick that in my pocket for later on. So as I said, we want to try and keep the ground covered as much as possible. And we want to keep the ground productive as well. So here we have alfalfa, which many of you may know. It's one of the smallest sprouts that you can buy at the health food shop. That's how often a lot of people know alfalfa. But it's often grown as a source of fodder, of food for animals. But But the most important thing about this plant is that it's a nitrogen fixer, otherwise known as leguminous. And again, we'll cover this in greater detail in a future video. But basically, all of the plants here, they need nitrogen in order to be able to be green and to be able to fuel the processes that happen within inside the plant. And it's funny because up here in the air above me, in the atmosphere, the majority of the gases in the air that we breathe is nitrogen. I think it's 76% or something like that. Whereas down here in the ground, there's almost no nitrogen, and the plants really need it. So one of the only ways for the nitrogen to get from the sky back into the ground is with plants like this. So plants like this will absorb that nitrogen from the sky, and with the help of a microorganism, of almost like a fungus that lives on the roots, that's called rhizobium, it helps to trap that nitrogen into the soil so that plants like this can use it, and then these plants will also share it with other plants that can't lock that nitrogen themselves. So these nitrogen fixing plants are a really important part of the ecosystem. But as I said, once these grow, we will chop them and we will drop them and feed them to the vegetables. So basically within this system, at the beginning we put in some manure into these beds to make sure that we have a good start. But the idea is from now is that we want to have vegetables that are grown only by feeding them grass and alfalfa and other annual or perennial plants. So by adding this as a mulch, it will eventually break down into compost, and that will eventually feed these plants. So the idea is we don't want to bring any inputs into the system. We want to be able to provide everything that the plants need from the system itself. Yeah. So we only, in the end, have outputs of food. We don't need inputs of fertility. So that's one example of how we've covered this pathway with alfalfa, and that's a perennial, so that will exist there for years on end. And then here behind me we have another example of the sorghum, and this was put in about 3 months ago. So that's about 3 months of growth. You can see it grows very quickly, and I've actually let this grow too much. You can see now at the top of the plants is now going to seed. The best thing for any of these chop and drop or biomass accumulators, as they're also called, is to actually chop their heads off before they flower, for lots of different reasons, and I'll get into that in the future. Okay, so in the future I'd really like to help you understand the very specific combination of trees that we have here. There's a very specific mix and combination of diversity here to make sure that basically we have a very high level of cooperation instead of competition. You know, especially when we see a forest which just has one tree grown in monoculture, basically all those trees are at competition with each other. There's not much cooperation that's happening in a forest like that. So in this system, often when people see how many trees we've got so closely planted to each other, they think, these trees are too close, surely this can't work. But really what we're trying to do here is mimic a natural forest system as closely as we possibly can. So many of the trees here are actually here to feed to the other trees, in the sense of, just like with the grass we were feeding to the vegetables, some of these branches we will chop and we will feed to the ground, once again, first of all to act as mulch, then to break down as compost, to feed the other trees that we do really want to produce food from, that we do really want to grow. So, for example, this is a false pepper tree, and this is one of the trees that we use for what we call biomass accumulation, or a chop and drop tree, as it's known in permaculture. And often in permaculture these are called the pioneer trees because they grow very quick. They really help to create shade in those beginning couple years, whereas some of the other slower growing trees might not be able to do that. And some of the slower growing trees will appreciate the support that these trees give them while they're starting to become established. So basically we've got grass-fed vegetables and we've got tree-fed trees. So once again, we've put a certain amount of manure into these tree lines at the very beginning, But then from here on in, we're trying to only make sure that the trees can survive simply from the other branches that are fed to the productive trees. So not only are we creating biomass, mulch, compost, and eventually good soil and a topsoil that keeps on getting bigger in thickness, but we're also actually starting to affect how the trees communicate with each other. And one of the ways that this tree will communicate with the tree next door is that once I've chopped some of these branches off, this tree will realize that it's kind of had a bit of a haircut, that it's had a bit of a prune, and it will release hormones through the roots. I think one of those hormones is called gibberellic acid, and the tree next door will listen to that chemical signal, and it will grow more because of that message that it's had from the tree next door. So it's almost as if the tree next door is saying, I've had my head chopped off, so I can't really use the water and nutrition that's available. Why don't you use it, my next door neighbour, because you haven't had your head chopped off. So basically, not only are we creating the mulch and topsoil, but we're actually sending chemical message to the other trees that they should grow even more. And we really see that when we prune a system, that the trees that we don't prune suddenly explode in growth. Okay, so here we have a tree line, very densely planted with lots of different trees. We basically have 5 or 6 classifications of trees, and we put the right mix, the right blend of those trees together to make sure that they're at cooperation instead of competition. But obviously there's a certain role of management that we need to do to make sure that they stay at cooperation. So there's a certain amount of observation that we need to do to make sure that are things happy, are they looking after each other, or is there a bit of competition going on? So it's really managing complexity when we manage a system like this. So this guy is a holly oak in English. This is an evergreen oak. So this will start to produce acorns in a few years' time. And this is what we would call a climax species, because basically this is the tree that will possibly live the longest out of all of the trees in this system. This can live anywhere from kind of 500 to over 1,000 years. So basically some of these trees might only live 20 years, some other trees might live 50 or 100 years. But the thing is that if this tree was growing by itself in the middle of a field, it really wouldn't be very happy. And because it's got all these other trees around it as friends and almost like parents that are protecting it and giving it shade, obviously we're producing huge amounts of biomass from these other trees that will then go to feed this tree. So basically sometimes we're using non-native invasive species to bring back native slow growing species. So that's quite a paradox. I'll say that again. We're using sometimes non-native invasive species, managing them well to bring back native slow growing species. So this is the tree, or one of the trees that used to cover the whole of Spain. The whole of Spain used to be covered in forest. Just like we have oak trees in England where I come from. They say with both countries that a squirrel used to be able to hop from tree to tree from the top of the country to the bottom of the country without ever touching the ground. But now obviously Spain and England are very different places, very barren, very open. Okay, so I'd love to show you this tree here. This is called an albizia, and we've got many of these trees planted as well within the agroforestry system. These we use as chop and drop, as biomass accumulators. I'm pretty sure they're also nitrogen fixers as well. I think they're in the leguminous family. The reason I'm showing you this tree is because we planted this tree at the same time when we planted all the other trees a year and a half ago. So in a way this is our fair test, because often when I bring farmers here from the local area to see our project and they see how close our trees are planted together, they're literally, their head explodes. They say, no, this is impossible. Your trees are not going to grow. They're not going to be happy. You're going to have too much competition. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why we put some of these trees down here by themselves. So here is a tree grown by itself. It's given a lot of space around it to make sure that it's given the space that people think that it needs. But it's hardly grown at all in a year and a half. And we've tried to give it the same amount of water, we've tried to give it the same amount of manure to begin with, to have a fair test as possible. But I'm showing you this basically to say that if trees grow together in the right combination, in the right family, in the right community, they start to form relationships, and they start to create what we can call a macro being. They start to work together as a forest. Yeah. So some of these trees that we've grown in the agroforestry system, in the first year they grew to almost 3 or 4 meters, and we've pruned them so many times in the last year and a half. So it's really obvious that planting trees in the right combination makes them grow a lot faster, and they're a lot happier, and they have the right kind of support that they need. So thank you for coming along with me today on this tour of the garden. I would really like to continue doing updates about how this project evolves, the things that we learn, the mistakes that we've made. I'd really like to share with you guys all the different ways how this system functions and how you could do it yourself at home, no matter what country you live in. You just need to choose the right plants for your area. So please come back. This is going to be an adventure. This is going to be a journey. I'd love for you guys to be a part of it. We'll be making lots of content, lots of videos, and come back for more. Thanks again. Much love.